Welcome to the Curious Conversations Collaborative with your hosts Karen Revell and Tessa and Karen. We hope by listening to these conversations you will gain insight, awareness, perspective, inspiration and motivation to create a career or business and life that lights you up and brings you happiness and joy.
All right. Hello, Tessa.
Hi, Karen. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Good to be back. So today we're talking about finding your feet. So if anyone out there that's listening who might be in a transition of some sort, whether that's changing career or starting their own business for the first time, or maybe have been in a business for a while and have decided to go in a new direction, or even, a big transition in your life, the other aspects of your life. We're going to be talking about how that impacts us and perhaps how to manage that a little better.
Yeah, and I think today we're going to talk about it more generally with some different examples from our own lives and businesses. And then in the next episode, we actually will talk specifically about this podcast, the Curious Conversation Collaborative. Kind of give you an example as well, how with a new project, when you're starting something new, that can be a new project as well within maybe your own business or within your career, maybe even a promotion or something. So how also a specific project can be a real example of how that also is again every new start. Again, there's elements of having to find your own feet. So we'll use that in the next episode as a specific example, just going into that. But today we just want to talk, kind of set the scene of like what happens when we have a transition or when we start something new, and what is the best way of actually finding your feet. And I do think, of course, everyone is, it's always personal, like it might be different for different people. What works for one doesn't necessarily work for the other. But I do think there's also some general points that might be really useful for people to talk about, of like that can be things that can be done both maybe before the transition happens, during, and a little bit after as well, once it's ready. Happening.
Yeah, and I think it's important to talk about, we're talking about a transition here that you are planning, you've decided to do, not one that's forced upon you, because that is a different situation where, that can involve a lot of emotional upheaval.
Yes, exactly.
And that, so we're not talking about that today. We're talking about something that you've made a decision to either change career, change business, whatever. You're doing something in your life that is a positive move in your opinion. You're choosing to go in this new direction.
Yes.
And you're probably really excited about it. You've got lots of ideas, and you've got a lot of energy in that beginning, that new beginning. So yeah, I think we've talked.
I think just to say one more thing about that, if you don't mind, which I think it's important, because I think most transitions in our life always have an element of a positive choice, and sometimes maybe some elements of feeling that we have to. So I think, again, we talk today about something that you choose to do, that you want, but of course there might be an element that's the reason why you're choosing it. There might be some elements that you feel you have been pushed towards that. And that can be important to recognize as well, because if you don't honor that most of the time, like when we choose something, like for instance, even when we decide to quit our job and start our own business, that although that's very exciting, there might be also some elements there of a little bit of resistance or fear or something like, oh, is this really what I want? So it's okay that, like, even if this is something you choose to do or chose to do, that there might, of course, be some elements in there of feeling that you didn't have a choice or that you had to or whatever. But that's still very different from a situation where you kind of feel that it really completely happened to you and you had no say in it whatsoever. So yeah, I just want to say, like, because I think
I think, you know, that fear and trepidation comes up all the time, you know, and it's that having that balance between, do you have an element of fear, but you're also excited because this is about your growth and you're stretching your comfort zone? Or is the fear actually stopping you from moving forward? And that's what I would term resistance. It's actually coming up so much in a way that's actually, you know, making you avoid doing some of the things that you need to do to move forward in this new direction. So, you know, fear will always happen. But it is that element. I always feel that if you've got that element of excitement in there as well, it's fear, but it's positive. But you know, when you get to the point where the fear takes over, then you're unlikely to move forward. You're gonna hit against walls, and you're gonna go off in lots of different directions, or doing a lot of avoidance tactics and things like that. So it is absolutely right, Tessa, to actually recognise when that fear comes up and what level's it at, and are you still excited?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So just to actually, I think, you know, we both have worked being employed in different areas maybe, but and we both now run our own businesses. So maybe it might be nice to have that as one example about like, you know, for yourself, for instance, like did you just decide and do it, or did you plan it very carefully? And how did you feel during or before or after?
I didn't plan it at all, in the sense of it was definitely my choice. But as you said, like, you know, I'd been in a career for, you know, 25 years in the corporate world, reached very senior positions, but it was very hard work, lots of sacrifice. And, you know, probably a common reason for why a lot of people leave to work for themselves is that you just want the control of your time back, that freedom and flexibility over your time. And also just looking up at the next rung on the ladder and saying, do I really want that? You know? So for me, it was that, you know, it was a choice, and I left before I had planned what exactly I was going to do. I had retrained as a coach. I mean, my background was in finance, so I was an accountant in large corporates for all that time. I'd retrained as a coach, personal development coach, but I hadn't really thought about, well, what's my business going to look like? What am I offering? You know, who's my market? All of that. You know, I think a lot of us, we start a business and we just get out, and then we think we can go through all this stuff, not really knowing perhaps the size of what we're facing. Well, that was I wouldn't say I'd recommend that to everyone, but that was my the way it went for me. And yeah, so, and perhaps, I don't know, if I'd known everything that needed to happen, maybe I wouldn't have done it. I don't know, but so there is that element of perhaps not knowing everything is quite.
And I think and I think that's the thing, right? I mean, this is what we're talking about, finding your feet. I think if you're in a position where you can plan ahead a little bit, that can be very useful. Like a lot of time, a lot of my clients who don't feel aligned either in their work or in their life or whatever's going on, they kind of feel they have to do something right now, right? And if you really feel you have to, I always think, like, obviously there is that bit of like follow that drive. At the same time, it can be good to prepare a little bit. But again, as you said, like I think there's two sides to that. Like if you knew everything that would happen, then you might not do it. At the same time, you cannot know everything that would happen, because as much as you plan, something unforeseen, we have talked about that before, might happen, and you might not, and things might actually turn out differently. So I think there's that balance between, I always see it like this, as I said, like before, you know, when most people, when you own a house, you do take out insurance against fire or something else, all these kind of things, but you're not going to every day worry about whether there will be a fire or not. So it's like this planning of like, you don't have to go in like, oh, I don't care, just see what happens, and then your house goes up in smoke and you have nothing left. But at the same time, so there has to be that balance between planning and letting things go a little bit, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And what about you, Tessa? Because you actually moved from one country to another to live, and that was quite a big transition. How was that for you? Did you plan that completely?
Well, so there's two sides to my story. One is the move to the Netherlands, which I think, like, I've lived in Ireland for 15 years. And I think there's been always parts, like, so for me, the moving to the Netherlands partly did feel a little bit like it was my choice when I did it. But there was also a lot of circumstances around that, why I felt I had to make such a choice. So that one was a little bit harder for me, in the sense like that in a way I would have loved to spend my whole life in Ireland, but it was also linked to relationships and other things. So there's things there why I chose to move back to the Netherlands. Although there was always, there were certain elements of living in Ireland that I would have found difficult compared to living here. So, but the interesting thing there was for me that there was, when the time came that I felt staying in Ireland wasn't really an option, that I had that moment where I felt, okay, well then I have to move right now. And I went into planning mode, and I went into like, right, I'm going, while I have my house and my job in Ireland, I'm gonna look in the Netherlands to buy a house or rent a house, either way, and get a job, and then I'll move. And that didn't work, because when you're looking for houses here and you have to travel back to Ireland and back forth, that was just too difficult. So at some stage I had to say, okay, well then I just have to move over and see what happens. And the interesting thing was that at that point, this was around mid 2016, I just wasn't ready. And I actually had to accept that. I actually had to say, okay, so this is that bit between planning and letting things just move. Was, okay, now I know this is happening, and now I have to feel ready to give up my job, give up I have my own practice already in Ireland as well, and give everything up, because that was a big deal. And as soon as I allowed myself to say, okay, I need to find the courage, I need to just allow myself to get into that space to be ready for that, it took another year. And that was okay. And then, but then the interesting thing, when I did move, the day that I cancelled my flat in Ireland, my landlord told me that they were actually selling the place, which in Ireland is a reason to be kicked out. So if I hadn't made that choice and I hadn't done that, it would really have happened to me, because the rents had risen so much in Ireland, so I would have never been able to find something else. So interesting thing is, I think that when you get into that space where you find that balance and when you let things flow, then you will often find that things happen in a certain way. But just to say one thing about when I started my own business, because for me that was interesting as well. I am sometimes a little bit risk averse and find it difficult to jump. So sometimes a little push can be helpful. So in my case, actually, I worked in different charity organizations in Ireland, and there were really, the last job I was with people with disability, which was really rewarding, but also really tough, because we really worked with the most severe situations where people really weren't getting the support they really needed. So there was some really, really tough cases where, stuff you really don't really want to know about, that's actually happening to people. And I had then started to learn to practice NLP and life coaching and Reiki and different massages. I really wanted to start for myself, but I was quite scared to give up a pretty good job. And then there was a reorganization, and there were some jobs would be lost. And I actually asked my organization, I said, well, what would happen if a few people would go part-time? And they said, well, then more people can keep their job. So I said, okay, I'll go part-time, because this is perfect. I can keep my job, and I can start in a more safe way for myself. So that's how I ended up working for myself.
Yeah, and I think sometimes if we can take those sort of stepping stones to where we want to go, that transition can feel easier. And whereas, you know, quite often, like you say, we find ourselves in situations where we feel we've kind of got to make this big leap. And even though I did it, like I say, I wouldn't necessarily say it's advisable. But it's also, again, I think you've got to think about financial circumstances as well, especially if you're changing job or starting a business or whatever. You've got to make sure that you've got financial resources that are going to keep you going for a while, until things, you know, really get going for you, or you know, even if it's a new job, to make sure that you know, because quite often if you're actually making a complete career change, you might find that you have to take a cut in salary or whatever. So you really need to start thinking about, you know, having a bit of reserve, you know, some financial resources there that you can live on while you're going through this period of change. Because if you then have to worry about, you know, how am I going to live as well, how am I going to get money in to live on top of what you're trying to achieve, then you're really going to be pulled in all different directions. So I think the financial aspect is quite important to consider as well.
And I think that literally makes it easier to go through that process of finding your feet, right? And I think it's also something to consider, because again, this is, I think the part that's universal for everyone is this element of planning, to really know is like, okay, what do I have now? What do I need? Like it's different whether you're paying a monthly rent on your own, or whether you have a partner who also has a job, or whether you own a house without mortgage. You know, there's all these different things. So those things you can actually plan. You can put them on paper. You can know exactly at the moment, like what your expenses are, what your income, you know, what other income might be. Again, it's different whether you're living together with someone or married or whatever, you know, and you have that support, or, you know, there's all these things to consider. And I think that's very important. And the other thing I think is also to be really, really honest with yourself. I once had a client who worked in a well-paid job in corporate, in banking actually, and but felt that the work itself wasn't really fulfilling enough, wasn't meaningful enough, so had big plans around wanting to do work with either charity or something else, but also said they liked their big car and wanted 3 holidays a year. So there we had to talk a little bit about, like, you know, there's nothing wrong with if that's important to you, but if you're planning something, then you might find it very difficult to find your feet if you have just idealistically given up a job and took on something else which doesn't support a lifestyle that's important to you. And I think that is really being honest with yourself.
Yeah, and I think that is a really good point, Tessa. And you know, for people, I mean, we're both trained coaches, so we understand the importance about knowing your own values and what is important to you, because that's, you know, living a life in alignment to your values is what's going to make you happy and fulfilled. So being clear on that first before you make some of these decisions is really important, because otherwise, like you say, you could be following one thing but lose so much else that you find is really important to you, and then actually find this wasn't the right direction to go in at all. So and I
think again, the certain things you can know, like, you know, if you're wanting to do something completely different in a career, for instance, give up your job and go, I don't know, help children in Africa, it's incredibly noble. But if you are very attached to proper hygiene with like showers and other things, this might not work for you. So there has to be also some realism, and there's certain things you can figure out by talking to people who have done that. It can be very, very useful. So I think there is certain elements that can be planned. But then there can be the things like, which I experienced as well with working for myself or even moving to the Netherlands, is that sometimes you just have to jump, you know, because you can't figure it all out before you do it. So you also have to just do it. And I think maybe we can talk like 1 or 2 more minutes now, and then we'll save the rest for next week when we talk about specifically use our
But I think what we're really saying is that you can plan for these things, and you need to be clear about what's important to you, so the direction that you're going in is the right direction. But don't get too rigid about that plan. Don't allow the plan to stop you from actually moving forward. You know, don't get into that sort of, I've got to have it all planned out before I can move forward. Be willing to take a leap of faith as well.
Yeah.
And getting that balance right is probably the hardest thing. And, you know, 90% of us probably don't get it right, and you're going to learn through that process. But that's where I still come back to this feeling of, is there that feeling of excitement there that is going to move you forward despite the fear, but just be a little bit grounded as well, and have that edge on realism as well, as, you know, does it all feel right?
Yeah. So I think for me, the important things are the practical things that you can figure out. Do write them down, do figure them out, do plan them all, get out your insurances that are relevant if you like. Then also do really listen to your heart. Do follow also what really feels the right thing to you, and be honest to yourself and see that you can do that in stages. You don't have to do it all at once.
Absolutely.
And I think one important thing I would like to add, do not be afraid of asking and accepting support. And that can be from family and friends. That can be maybe from colleagues, or maybe a business that you've worked for before, or it could be a coach, or it could be a mentor, you know, but do not be afraid. Don't think you have to do it all by yourself, because I think that's one of the things from all the transitions that I've gone through in life, whether they were personal or professional or starting for myself. I think most difficulties around struggling to find my feet came from thinking that I had to do it all by myself.
Absolutely. Yeah. Cool. Well,
and that's why we started the collaborative.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about that next time.
Yes.
And and if anything came up for you from this, if you want to share your stories about how what transitions you have gone through, or what things you have done that really helped you in finding your feet, please do let us know, because you might be helping other people with that as well. So I think it would be really great to hear from you. So and if there is something either one of us can help you with, if you're going through a transition, then of course you're very welcome to send us a message, or put something in the comments wherever you're watching or listening to this.
Yeah, that's great. So until next time, we will see you again on another Curious Conversations. Bye.
Great talking to you. Talk to you next time.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.